Hello, everyone, and welcome so much to this event called The Ways We Know Ourselves and Others Online, hosted by York Festival of Ideas. My name is Ricky Amundsen, and I will be the chair of today's event. I am an associate lecturer in social media and society in the Department of Sociology at the University of York. Before we get started with the event, I have a few technical notes for you. If you are watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have any technical issues, such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is going to be recorded, so you will be able to watch it again. And subtitles are available in this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So now it's my great honor to finally introduce to you today's speakers, Dr. Nicola Fox-Hamilton and Dr. Catherine Talbot. Dr. Nicola Fox-Hamilton is a cyberpsychology researcher and visual communicator. She teaches cyberpsychology at both undergraduate and postgraduate level in the Institute of Art, Design and Technology, Dunleary, Ireland. Her area of interest in cyberpsychology is generally in online communication, and she's particularly interested in online dating and interpersonal attraction, as well as expression and perception of personality in online platforms. Dr. Catherine Talbert is a cyberpsychologist specializing in social media, health, and qualitative methods. She's a lecturer at Bournemouth University. She's interested in the formation and management of online identities by marginalized groups. And her work considers how technologies can be developed to promote well-being and social inclusion. Catherine is also a committee member of the British Psychological Society, the BPS, and the Cyberpsychology section. So to get us all started, Catherine and Nicola, would you be able to maybe introduce yourselves and your areas of research?
Sure, I'll go first if that's okay, Catherine. So as you said, I'm Dr. Nicola Fox-Hamilton. I did my PhD in the University of Wolverhampton, and what I was essentially doing was carrying on from my master's research. So I did a master's in cyberpsychology in the Institute of Art, Design, Technology, where I now work. And I started looking at online dating in that and looking at the difference between how Irish and American men present themselves in their dating profiles, which is quite interesting. First of all, American guys write a lot more than Irish guys, a lot more. They have a lot more to say about themselves. But I continued on looking at that and looking at how people express their personality in their dating profiles and other texts online, and then how we also perceive that. So when we read somebody's text, can we actually tell what someone's personality is like from that? And how do we react to that? So when we form a judgment of how attractive we find somebody, say, in a dating profile, is that based on their actual personality traits or not? So the very short answer to that is we're very bad at telling what someone's personality is like from just text. And we do make judgments, but they're probably wrong because we're really bad at telling what they're like. But since my PhD, I've done some research looking at online dating during COVID and during lockdowns, because obviously normally people will date online and arrange to meet somebody quite quickly. So that's changed a lot because people didn't know when they were going to be able to meet, and we were locked down for weeks and months at a time. So that's been really, really interesting. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the findings from that a little bit later when we get into chatting.
Okay, yes, so thank you for the introduction, Ricky. My name's Dr. Catherine Talbot, and I am a lecturer in psychology at Bournemouth University. And my research, it typically focuses on social media and identity, which is why I'm here today. And I've conducted research in this area with a wide range of groups. So this includes people with eating disorders, people with dementia and carers, and also LGBTQ+ individuals. And I'll get more into some of that research later. But I guess what my main interest is online communities, and how do these online communities affect lived experiences? What are the benefits of them? What are the challenges as well? And my PhD research, which I did at the University of Exeter a while ago now, That focused on how people with dementia use Twitter and how they present themselves on Twitter. And whenever I tell people about this research, they always respond, "Oh, I didn't know people with dementia could use social media," and then will start telling me a story about one of their grandparents. But actually, we are seeing this rising community of older adults and people with dementia who are using social media such as Twitter and Facebook, and are actually getting a lot of benefits from it in terms of connecting with others and being able to express themselves online when they haven't really got those opportunities in their offline environments. So yeah, that's just a short introduction to my research, and I'll speak a little bit more about some of that later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much both. So thinking about the topic of today's event, so how we present ourselves online, many of us seem to think that when we present ourselves online, we tend to present a perfect but untrue image of ourselves. So drawing on your research and expertise within this area of online self-presentation, is this an idea that you agree with?
Shall I go first, Nicola? So I think the key point here is really that it differs between individuals in their actual reasons for using social media, and even in what type of social media platforms they're using, which again, I think we'll come to a bit later on. But what we do know is that how we present ourselves online, it's carefully crafted. And it's often quite a deliberate process in the sense that we really think about what information we want to communicate about ourselves online and how we want to communicate this information as well. So it's not necessarily that this is a true or authentic version, it's just a different version of ourselves that's just a bit more carefully crafted and far more dynamic. And there are a few points that I kind of want to pick up on there. So you said about this idea of perfect, and this really made me think of some of my research that's looked at body image. And, you know, our bodies are part of ourselves and they're part of our identity. So if we think of some social media such as Instagram, for example, and how we choose to present ourselves on there because it's very visual, you know, we can retouch images, we can filter them to create these perfect pictures that show us in a very positive way. And this is particularly true perhaps when we think of celebrities and influencers as well. And these might serve as role models for people, particularly young women. And this can be quite problematic actually, as it can create and really normalize these unrealistic bodies and potentially negatively impact body image as well, which some research has been found, sorry. But that being said, actually, this isn't a new thing. Magazines have been doing this for a very long time. And, you know, we're now also seeing this rising trend on social media with body positivity movements. So we're seeing more authentic bodies, more authentic identities as well, which really challenge this traditional idea about having a perfect body and a perfect self, I guess. What do you think, Nicola?
That's really, really interesting. So when I was coming at it from the perspective of my PhD work, looking at how we perceive other people online, there's quite a bit of research looking at whether our social media, and in particular Facebook, because that was where a lot of research was done for a while, is actually representative of who we are. And so there were studies done where they got strangers to look at somebody's profile and say what kind of personality they had. And they also got their like close friends and family and some acquaintances to look and also rate their personality to see what kind of personality they had. And they found surprising overlaps between them. So people were quite accurate in telling what somebody was really like from their Facebook profile. So although it's curated, and when we're online, we have an ability to curate our profiles and ourselves in a way that's much more difficult offline, there's still a degree of accuracy because most of these platforms, particularly social media, are anchored to our offline selves. So we're friends with people who know us offline. So if we present something that's very different to that, they're probably going to call us out on it. But if we present something that's like a positive spin on it, people understand that they're doing it themselves. They're carefully editing what they put up. Nobody wants to put up the worst photograph of themselves. They choose the better one to put up. But you even see differences on different platforms between how that works. Like people will put up a lot of photographs from an event on or a night out on Facebook, but they'll put the best one on Instagram. So some platforms are a little bit more curated than others, which is quite interesting, I think. But I do think in those kind of spaces that are connected to who we are offline, it tends to be quite real a lot of the time, and not so perfect.
I was also going to say that that actually relates to some of the research on online health communities as well, if we think about that. Those people there, they share details about their experiences of living with certain conditions, and by nature that isn't always positive, you know. So for example, my research looking at how people with dementia use Twitter, they use it to discuss their experiences of living with the diagnosis, the struggles that they face, difficulties in relationships, and they describe it in quite vivid detail. And that, you know, that isn't a perfect picture of a person's life, is it? And if they didn't reveal those quite vivid details, then they perhaps wouldn't be able to access the support that they really need.
And actually, that's something really interesting that has come up in lots of different research, looking at authenticity. When people are able to be their authentic selves, it's much easier to connect with others and to build on relationships and to get social support and social capital, and really like get something out of your interactions. If you're not doing that, if you're pretending to be something else, a perfect version of yourself or someone else or another version of who you are, it's much more difficult to do that. If you even go back to the very early research, you know, where there were, you know, worlds where people would create a character for themselves, but the longer they spent in the world, the more they started to form relationships with people in there and make friends with them. And then they would move away from that character towards their real self, because it's very hard to maintain a relationship when you're not being your real self.
And I have, there's a question here in the chat for you, by someone who's saying, do you think with all the virtue signaling going on, that people are airbrushing their personality as much as their photographs? So many people come across as having the perfect belief, which Facebook encourages with the budget it has designed for people, i.e. in terms of COVID vaccinations and so on.
I think that's a really interesting question. So I think this is one of those things where we have a little bit of a bias about what we're doing and what everybody else is doing. We think that everybody else is curating this perfect thing online, but we're not. We're being very authentic. And I think everybody is curating themselves to a degree, some more so than others, but everybody's doing it a bit. And I think because there's a semi-permanent nature to what we put online. So if we write a comment that's racist or homophobic or anything like that, you know, 10 years ago, and it's still there, there's a potential for people to find it. And so people tend to be a little bit careful sometimes about what they say, and they'll sometimes go back and like erase things or clean up their timeline, because they want to be quite careful about what they're saying, because it can come back to hurt people. I mean, everybody grows and changes over time, and people might hold beliefs that they no longer believe in, and so they might want to go back and change things like that. But I think it's also a really good way for people to be able to express what's important to them, important parts of their identity or their beliefs or their values or their attitudes, and things like, you know, COVID vaccinations. I think a lot of people are using that as a way to signal their belief in science and the fact that we should listen to scientists and things like that. So it's not just about vaccinations. And I think the idea of virtue signaling itself can be a little bit problematic, because that kind of assumes that when people are saying things like this, that the only reason they're doing it is to let other people know about it, and they don't actually believe this. And I think it's a good question to ask is, why do I think that's virtue signaling instead of an actual attitude or belief that this person holds?
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with what Nicola just said, actually. And there's this sense of what you can put online, what you put online is permanent, and it can come back to haunt you. And I don't think it's necessarily that people are altering their personalities or pretending to be someone else. They're just perhaps being a bit more careful about what they post. And, you know, we are now as a society very aware of how things on the internet are permanent and can come back to find you. But then again, there are some spaces where you can be anonymous on the internet. And I think we're probably going to come to this later. And that can, you know, encourage some Quite different behaviours, shall we say, such as trolling and, you know, harassment as well, because you're not accountable, because you're anonymous on the internet. You know, there is that saying, no one knows you're a dog on the internet.
Thank you. And before we move on to the next question, we have another question for the audience related to what you both have been saying, which asks, does your research find that people are more outspoken from the anonymity granted from social media, or that they are more cautious due to the international audience that could misunderstand or cancel them? So I think this question really also gets to the significance of context, which can be quite easily blurred when we're in digital spaces.
Yeah, that's definitely one of those "it depends" answers. So there's lots of research on anonymity online because it's one of the things that's very difficult to have offline. And the findings are actually quite varied. So some spaces where people are anonymous, they will say more, reveal more, self-disclose more, say things that they wouldn't in a face-to-face setting. But in other spaces, that's not necessarily the case. So like for bloggers who are identifiable tend to give more information about themselves than those who are anonymous. So it kind of depends on the space, but anonymity can play a part, but it's usually in combination with another factor. So if you've got an anonymous space that has social norms that allow people to behave in a particular way, you're more likely to get that behavior in that space. If you've got an anonymous space, so let's say, for example, a subreddit about, I don't know, republicanism in the States and about how great Trump is, you're more likely to get people saying things in a very vitriolic way. And this is from the research, I'm not just saying this. People will be much more extreme in their views. They'll use much more aggressive language than they might do face-to-face or in another setting where people know them. But in other settings, let's say like forums for people who are struggling to conceive, you might find that people are very polite, even though they're anonymous in that space, because there's a social norm around behavior in that space and about being kind to each other, and the community will act if somebody starts behaving outside of those norms. So it really depends on the context in which anonymity is happening.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, it does really depend on the space, and there'll be some spaces that you think could be quite positive and quite nice. I know there's been some research on Mumsnet, for example, that has found quite aggressive comments there, because you can be anonymous on there as well. Quite aggressive comments where some people just go in on some account holders. So yeah, it does depend on kind of the social rules and the social norms that really govern those groups. I mean, on Facebook, we often in the research talk about this thing called context collapse, which Nicola and Ricky will know lots about. But it's where offline we have all these relationships. So we have friends, we have family who perhaps won't ever meet each other because of spatial boundaries or just because they're not connected. Whereas if we think about Facebook, we suddenly have all these connections in one space, and this context that we normally have separating them completely collapses. So being anonymous on Facebook and actually being so therefore we're a bit more careful with our views on that space, which is quite different to other spaces where we can be more anonymous, and those contacts don't necessarily know that we're communicating in that way. They don't know these aspects of ourselves, and therefore we're not held accountable.
Wonderful, thank you. And you were talking before a little bit about how people might act differently to the way online to what they would necessarily always do offline. And I wanted to ask you whether you could tell us a bit more about whether you think people experiment with who they are, or perhaps take this opportunity to kind of try out different opportunities when they're online.
Yeah, and this is really exciting and quite interesting for me that social media actually provides this opportunity for us to test out certain aspects of our identities that we might not be comfortable showing offline for a variety of reasons. So some of my research has looked at LGBTQ+ individuals, and before they've come out, they will often go and test out this aspect of their identity or explore it online because they're not comfortable with their offline contacts knowing this, or they might be scared of discrimination as well, for example. And yeah, this is something I found with my research, which was conducted with LGBTQ plus students. And they really spoke about using social media as they transitioned to university to really understand and make sense of this aspect of themselves, and as well as providing access to supportive networks too. And what was really interesting actually was this seemed to be particularly important for students who were coming from rural areas. So while it was mentioned as important for everyone, those from rural areas who said they'd never met anyone offline who was LGBTQ plus, and therefore they went to social media and were actually able to see, oh my God, other LGBTQ plus people actually exist, and this is what it means to be part of this community, and to really make sense of it as well.
It's really, really interesting research. One of the things that I've found fascinating, not from my own research, but from reading others, is the idea that, young people, always online or offline, are finding out who they are. And so they're exploring different aspects of their identity. And it's a huge part of meeting their developmental needs to do that. And so they can figure out who they are. And they do that online as well as offline. But what's really interesting about that is, when they become adults, or as they move from, childhood to adolescence, or adolescence to adulthood, that is embodied online. We were talking about that permanent or semi-permanent nature of being online. And for some people, that's fine. They look back at it kind of fondly as a journey, and they look at themselves, and it's quite a nice thing for them to see. But for others, that can be really difficult. Seeing, behavior maybe that they wouldn't do now, or childishness that they don't want to be permanent online and things like that. And so people will spend quite a bit of time going back and looking over and recurating their timelines and stuff like that. And there's also a problem when they don't have control over it. So if their parents are constantly sharing images of them in a way that they're not very happy with. I mean, I personally wouldn't love if my teenage years were online somewhere that everybody could find. I was not cool. That's an understatement. And I think a lot of young people find that as well. And they weren't consenting to put those images up, and they have very little control over taking them down or managing that space. And that can be quite problematic for them. And worst case scenario, that can also lead to cyberbullying and things like that as well, when they don't have control over that space. So I think that's an interesting aspect of kind of exploring identity, but leaving a trail behind of that exploration as well.
I think also in terms of really making sense of ourselves and our identity as well, this is really important when applied to health as well, which I found, and particularly for people who are living with stigmatized health conditions. So for example, dementia. If they go on social media, they're able to quite openly discuss this aspect of their identity, which they again might not be able to do in their offline lives, and really make sense of it. So when I've spoken to people with dementia, they talk about this loss of identity after being diagnosed. They're no longer seen as a parent, they no longer can work, sometimes they can't drive, they really lose this aspect of themselves. And as a way of making sense of that, they go onto Twitter and they can see other people with dementia and get hints and tips of how to cope with the diagnosis, and really find a way of reinstating that sense of identity and figuring out who they are now, which I think is another interesting way of kind of experimenting and exploring online.
And we have a question from we have actually quite a few questions from the audience I would like to ask you, but there's one here that relates exactly to what you were just saying, Catherine, with someone asking, would you say that online friendships are just as valuable as in-person ones, or are too many aspects of the in-person ones missing from those that purely happen online?
That's a really good question, actually. And it's something that's come up in my recent interviews that looked at how people with dementia use digital technologies during the pandemic. And quite a few of them were living independently and feeling quite isolated. but actually they spoke about going onto social media or using Zoom to speak to other people with dementia and lots of different people. And I said to them, you know, do these feel like friendships to you? And very often they said yes, that in fact some of these people know more about me than my offline friends. And I think you can develop really real and quite close relationships with people just by interacting with them online. And I think quite a lot of us know that from living through the pandemic for the past year or so as well. But I'm sure Nicola's actually got some interesting inputs on that with her dating research as well.
Yeah, I was just about to say, so obviously dating and friendships are quite different because the expectations are different. So with friendships, you get to know somebody and you're not expecting when you meet that there has to be chemistry there, because that's really important, obviously, in a dating relationship. And that's something that's really difficult to determine online. Whereas friendships, you can learn about the person, you can connect, you can share. And when you meet in person without that expectation, it can be much easier to maintain that friendship. And some people find it easier to form friendships online as well. People who are socially anxious and shy can find it easier, and they're more likely to take those friendships offline as well. And we also know, like, parents worry all the time about their kids meeting strangers online. But one of the things we know is that lots of kids actually make good friends with other young people through gaming in particular, and sometimes social media and other spaces, and will often meet those friends offline and have almost uniformly very positive experiences from it. So there's definitely loads of research going back years, letting us know that friendships can be made online and are just as valuable, and sometimes even more so, because you can share, as Catherine was saying, in a way that you might not be able to do with your offline friend network, because you can find people who are specific to what you need and your interests or whatever situation you have.
Great, thank you. And I have a couple of questions who are getting into this topic of cyberbullying and trolling. So we have one question which says, what about trolling? Is this a downside of exploring another identity that social media allows for or gives a platform for? And the other question, which I think is quite related, asks, from your experience as researchers or being active on social media, would you say that being anonymous is promotive of more cyberbullying or abuse? And can you also comment on the advantages of being anonymous online?
Yes, so that very good questions. So yeah, I guess there is this sense, because of the sense of anonymity that we can have online, then it's something called this disinhibition effect, where essentially you're not held accountable for your actions if you're in a more anonymous space, and therefore it can encourage people to engage in certain behaviours such as trolling, such as cyberbullying, just because they feel there isn't necessarily going to be these punishments. Although, you know, we're seeing developments potentially that can hold these people accountable, but we'll see what happens soon within this space. But also to go to the positive side of it, because there are positives about being anonymous as well. So as I mentioned, people with health conditions, for example, they can be really honest about what they're experiencing in a way that they might not be able to in their offline lives. And therefore they can access support from other people too, which, you know, they might not have access to and really quite desperately need as well. What do you think, Nicola, as well in relation to that?
So I agree with absolutely everything that you say there. I'm interested in the question about, like, is trolling kind of trying out a part of an identity? And I don't think so. So what we know from the research about people who are trolling, they do it for a few different reasons. So some are doing it because they think it's funny. They often work in groups, or they're part of like a Reddit community where they kind of share what they've done and they all laugh about it and think it's funny. The recipient of it doesn't necessarily think it's funny at all, but that can be the motivating factor for it. The other reasons for doing it are specifically to disrupt and to cause harm, to break apart communities. So it's quite a divisive, negative thing a lot of the time, and quite deliberate. So it's not trying out a part of an identity, it is a part of a person's identity. So there's lots of evidence that personality traits play a part. So Machiavellianism and psychopathy and things like that play a part in you know, why people troll. It's part of who they are, and they like to cause harm sometimes. And then we also have this thing where everybody thinks that they're able to identify trolls online. But sometimes people are just a bit obnoxious. They're not necessarily trolling, or they're disagreeing with you. They're not necessarily trolling. And so, you know, there's a difference between kind of being outspoken in a negative way and trolling. Trolling's quite a specific thing as well. So sometimes people are, like Catherine said about the online disinhibition, their inhibitions are lowered. And so they'll say things and behave in ways that they wouldn't, and they'll be more aggressive in what they say, but they're not necessarily trolling. So it's not done deliberately to cause harm. They're just expressing what they believe at that time.
Thank you. And related, we have a question from the audience here, but I also wanted to ask about this. Do you have any thoughts on how different online spaces, so for instance, Facebook or LinkedIn or dating apps, how they might affect the ways we present ourselves online or understand others? So do we appear as the same person across these different platforms, or do our acts of self-presentation change according to the platforms that we operate in?
Yeah, so the research suggests that we very much tailor how we present ourselves depending on the platform. So if we think about how we are in our offline lives, for example, we present a very different version of ourselves depending on the context. So I'm a very different person with my parents than in a work meeting or when having drinks with my friends. And the same is also true for our online spaces. So, and there has been quite a bit of research on this. So there's been a recent paper by some really amazing researchers at the University of Bath who found that participants, they actively separated their professional platforms such as LinkedIn and their social platforms such as Facebook or Instagram, which probably makes sense when we actually think about it in relation to our own social media. So if you look at my Twitter, for example, mine's a very academic Twitter, and I'll tweet about my publications and my research, whereas my Instagram is a bit more social and traveling, well, not traveling at the moment, obviously, but seeing friends, that sort of thing. And again, this is something that I found in my research with LGBTQ+ individuals, where they actively sought out online spaces where they felt they could safely really explore and express their gender and sexual identities. So they discussed protecting this aspect of themselves on Facebook. So I remember one person saying to me, Facebook is where relatives live. Facebook is where you're sensible, which I think a lot of us can probably relate to. And, you know, this is because all of their family members were there and context collapse, what I was speaking about earlier. Whereas on other social media platforms, they just felt they could really talk more about LGBTQ+ issues and their experiences, and they felt they could reveal this aspect of themselves there, but presented a very different version of themselves on Facebook.
I think Catherine's actually covered almost all of it there really well.
Okay.
One thing I found interesting in that paper, is a really good paper, was the exception to that division of professional and social platforms. So LinkedIn for professional and, you know, Instagram for social and so on, was people who are building a brand for themselves, a personal brand, which I could identify with because, you know, I'm doing speaking engagements and I'm doing things, and I used to have my Instagram very walled off as personal only, but then I get tagged on things like this festival and various other things, and I've had to open it and turn it into a slightly more professional version, and it's very uncomfortable doing that. So when we break down those barriers between spaces, it can be quite uncomfortable, because it is that like audience diversity that you have, and trying to manage all of that within one space can be quite difficult.
Yeah, definitely. And just kind of related to that is, we've seen certain social media platforms try to merge and try and see this connectivity between platforms, but this isn't necessarily always a good thing. We don't always want to combine our identities. We don't want them to all be in one place. And actually, in some cases, what can be advantageous is this separation of identities and separation between platforms. So in the case of the LGBTQ+ community, for example, if that information about their identity were to go onto other social media where they don't want it to be, such as Facebook, this can have really harmful consequences for them. So really, perhaps what we need to think about in terms of moving technologies forward is to keep this separation between platforms.
It's interesting as well. So one of our masters in cyberpsychology students a few years back now did a lovely study looking at how kids manage their privacy on Facebook. And it was kind of before other platforms that kids had moved on to, so they were still primarily on Facebook. And it's obviously a situation where their grandparents and their parents, their aunties, as well as their friends were all on there. And these were teenagers aged 12 to 18. So how do they manage that space? And they were remarkably savvy about it. So basically anything that they didn't want their parents to see happened in like Messenger or in the chat behind the scenes, and only curated things that were okay for their grandparents and everybody else to see happened on the feed. And they were really quite careful about it. So there's, even within one space, there's ways to manage that, I think, as well. Most people don't use that audience function on platforms where you can only share with certain groups, but they tend to kind of censor themselves instead, or use it in a different kind of way so that they communicate what they want to with certain groups.
Thank you. And you've both been talking a little bit now about the risks that are involved in being online and presenting ourselves online. And we have some questions from the audience as well related to this issue of risk. So one question is, how do we overcome the risks associated with online friendships and anonymity, such as those seeking vulnerable people to exploit, at times under the guise of a vulnerable identity? Do you think social media will become better regulated in the future to overcome this?
I hope it does. I'm a little cynical about how willing social media is to regulate. There certainly are risks with forming friendships and romantic relationships online. So there's a considerable body of work looking at romance scams, for example, which I suspect may have gone up a little during the pandemic, because one of the big red flags about romance scams is someone who won't meet you in person, or can't for some reason meet you in person. And of course, nobody could meet in person. So that big red flag was something that was missing, and you had to look for the other things. There are definitely problems. There's something called hyperpersonal communication that happens when we're online. And essentially what it means is that if we like the initial impression of a person, there's a cognitive bias that kicks in, and it's called the halo effect. And it basically means we put on rose-tinted glasses when we look at everything else about the person. So let's say with a dating profile, you find their photograph attractive. So you read everything else in the profile and all their initial messages with a more positive view. And that can also happen with friendships as well. It's more likely to happen with romantic interest because there's different expectations there, but it can happen with friendships. And so you tend to build up this more intimate, more emotional relationship with the person. It particularly happens when you're communicating through text online, more so than video, because you can't see the person. You're missing a lot of the information that you have face to face. And so you've got a lot of gaps in your knowledge about the person. And because you're viewing it positively, you tend to fill in those gaps with very positive information, and you build up an idealized impression of the person. And that might lead you to share more information about yourself, disclose things that you might not normally, engage in behavior that you might not normally. So people might, for example, with dating, they might start sexting and they've never actually met the person. And it might not be something that they would have done necessarily before. But because they've got that built up emotionality and idealization, they have this idea of a perfect person in their head. And it can lead to problems when they meet in real life, that the person isn't quite like that. But it can also be problematic in the case of someone who's trying to scam somebody, or who isn't what they say, who's catfishing somebody, because it creates, a friendship or a relationship that you feel like is real and is very heightened. And you're more likely to ignore red flags that would let you know that there's something going on. So there's been cases where people have ignored the fact, they think they're talking to someone who's an American. And when they eventually talk to them on the phone and they have, say, an African accent of some kind, they'll ignore it. They don't even hear it, because they want to believe that the person is real, because the relationship has developed in such a way and become very real to them that they'll ignore all these red flags. So that is one of the risks of meeting new people online. So video chat is a good way to get around that, because you get a better sense of what the person's like. It's still, if you're looking for dating, still doesn't give you chemistry. You can't really tell that until you're face to face with somebody, but it gives you a much better sense of who they are, and it allows you to see that they are who they say they are, and that they match the photographs and things like that. So that's one way to avoid that risk, I think.
And in terms of really kind of avoiding some of these issues and perhaps overcoming them, I'm, like Nicola, a bit skeptical as well about whether the social media companies will actually do anything, or whether they're interested in doing anything. But yeah, so I have seen some discussions of bringing in verification for social media. So having it, say, tied to your passport or to your driver's license or whatever. But this then raises issues in terms of accessibility of social media as well, because you need to have the passport in the first place. You need money to do that. This then creates this barrier in who can actually be on social media and who can also get the benefits of it too. And like I said earlier as well, there are advantages to being anonymous and to having this anonymity. And we don't really want to take that fully away, just because some people who are a minority are doing these bad things online. So perhaps what we need instead is increased education around these issues. How can we spot these scammers? This is something I'm really interested in terms of older adults on social media as well, who we know are typically more targeted and more vulnerable to scams as well. And we're also seeing more of them get active online, especially because of the pandemic. So this is something I'm really interested in, is how can we work with older adults to increase their education about these issues and to spot the red flags, as Nicola was mentioning there.
Thank you. And Catherine, I wanted to follow up a little bit on what we've been talking about regarding the ability to be anonymous online as well, because I know you've been doing some research on eating disorder behavior online, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how that might or might not link to this affordance of anonymity that we might be provided online.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing, when I first initially got interested in psychology, actually, where I was really interested in eating disorders and also self-harm. And this research actually dates back to around the 1990s, where we saw this emergence of eating disorder and self-harm communities online that really advocated for these behaviours as being a lifestyle choice rather than being a medical problem. And instead they encouraged these behaviours. And there was mass public outcry about these communities on social media. And that's not to say that all of these communities are inherently bad, because there are some positive functions of them as well. But it seems that the anonymity of the internet and of social media has kind of enabled some of these communities to exist and to be on these in these corners of social media platforms, where if you know the hashtags, then you can find them. And because if you think about before social media existed, it would be quite rare to find people talking about eating disorders and talking about self-harm in a way that actually promotes it offline. That would be very rare. But yeah, we are seeing this quite a lot on social media, actually.
Thank you. And following up from that, I also wanted to focus a little bit on the influence that this COVID-19, that these related lockdowns have had on our online behavior, because we've seen how all of these social restrictions, repeated lockdowns have resulted in this quite widespread turn to online spaces for interpersonal communication and interaction, whether that be with people we already know, or in many cases with people that are entirely new to us. So we've never actually met them before. And Nicola, I wanted to ask whether you can tell us a bit more of whether you think we can really get to know someone that we haven't actually ever been able to meet in person.
So the research I was doing on online daters was really interesting. I interviewed 17 online daters during the first and second lockdown in Ireland back last year, and the UK and Nigeria as well. So a few different places. And it was really interesting. So there were kind of two main sets of people who had very different experiences. There were a lot of people who were trying to find somebody, or were using online dating even as entertainment to pass time, because there was so little that people could do. And they were finding it very frustrating. So they would, their normal process was go through the profiles, swipe right in the people they liked, connect with somebody, have a little bit of a chat, make sure that there were no red flags, and then arrange to meet for a coffee or a drink or a bite to eat or something like that. And that whole process was just utterly disrupted. And so they would swipe right, match with somebody, have a chat, usually about COVID to start with. And then where do they go from there? So it was either choose to continue talking to this person for weeks or potentially months before you can meet. And you don't even know if you really like them or not. Or kind of, as one of the participants said, kind of park them until things opened up. And normally you wouldn't be able to kind of just stop talking to somebody and then come back to them a few months later. But they kind of figured things were a bit different and that they might do that once lockdown lifted. And then there were other people who had actually met somebody who they thought was potentially a partner and who they were spending a lot of time talking to. And there were quite a few of these people. And I also did follow-up studies. I sent them questionnaires where they filled in, how are you doing now? If you were talking to somebody, how is that going now? And I had originally talked to people in kind of April, May, and I followed up in August and September. And the people who were talking to somebody, I was talking about that hyperpersonal communication, particularly when people were connecting through text, and people were texting a lot. So there was a lot of sharing, feeling like they were really getting to talk to someone in a way that they might not necessarily at the start of a relationship. There was a lot of feeling of, when there isn't sex to get in the way, because sometimes people will do that until they're comfortable enough to talk about something. That can kind of be the first option as a way to get intimate and comfortable. Without that, people had to share about themselves, and they also had to find ways to keep the conversation going. And so conversational skills became more important. And they found that they felt like they were really getting to know someone and that it was accurate, but they all had this cautious side of them that was like, well, we haven't actually met in person, so we're not sure what that chemistry would be like. In the follow-up surveys later, most of those had either faded away because trying to maintain that level of intimacy and sharing and conversation with someone that you've never met can be quite difficult, or they had met for a socially distant date or something similar, and the person wasn't quite who they thought, or there was no chemistry. But mostly it wasn't quite who they thought, and that there was something that they hadn't revealed in their conversations, or some aspect of them that was different to their perception. And I think a lot of it was because even though they were video chatting, most of them, they were also texting a lot. So for the people who hadn't really met a number of times, most that they didn't really work out at all, which is really unfortunate, because they felt like they were investing a lot of time in this. And a lot of people in the initial interviews were talking about, I hope it does work, because if it doesn't, then I've spent a lot of time talking to this person, and maybe they'll end up being a friend. But I think most of them didn't even really necessarily end up being a friend either, because it was meant for something different, which didn't work out. So for romantic relationships, it can be more difficult. There's definitely cases where people have met online and communicated for a considerable period of time and met, and it worked. Perhaps the pressures of the lockdown, the pandemic, all of those kinds of things heightened everything and made it a bit more difficult. But certainly the participants in my study, found it difficult, and it wasn't entirely successful.
Great, thank you. And we do have a lot of wonderful questions from the audience as well. So I would like to ask you one of these now, which is, have you ever come across any indication that people may be deriving some sense of their own identity, maybe even self-esteem, based on how others react to their online presence, like using, for example, likes and comments?
Yeah, so I know in terms of the body image literature as well, there's quite a lot of research suggesting that a lot of primarily young people, young women, will get a lot of their self-esteem on how they look based on whether an image gets likes. And I know some people have also said, you know, if an image doesn't get a certain amount of likes, they'll actually take it down and then repost it again to try to get more likes and then more validation as well from that. So there is this relationship between that and self-esteem as well. But I do also think, you know, we need to give young people some credit as well nowadays, that it's, and move the conversation on a bit. I think they're actually a lot more critical of these online spaces now. There's a growing awareness of, you know, how some of these social media companies are perhaps using our data and how things aren't always as it seems. And, you know, a lot of young people do seem critical of that now, and it doesn't always seem to be about the likes as much.
And I think they're also fairly aware of how curated things are and, you know, the meaning of what they do online. Like they're pretty savvy when it comes to how they use social media and other platforms as well. You know, they're not just kind of doing stuff without thinking about it. I think a lot of young people are quite intelligent and thoughtful about what they do.
Thank you. And what perhaps might be your final question of the day is, do you agree that the design of social media platforms can change someone's identity over time? I.e., in your experience, does the attention paid to capturing each moment of one's life for social media result in a change of personality?
So I think personality tends to be relatively stable. Obviously, it changes more when you're young as you're developing your self-concept and you know, figuring out who you are. I think everything that we do changes us and shapes our identity and who we are. I would say that how we interact and who we interact with, whether it's online or offline, is going to change who we are and our personality to a degree, particularly when we're younger, but how we express that personality and so on when we get older. So the answer is probably yes, but that's not necessarily a negative thing if that's the intent of kind of finding out that from the question. But I think everything we do does change who we are.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing, actually, that that it probably does, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can help us to figure out who we are and or to make sense of something that's really horrible that's happened to us or that's been quite traumatic. It can help us to get a community sense of identity as well, you know, because we're not just defined as individuals, we're defined as well as collectives, and this can be incredibly valuable. So, you know, these interactions, they can impact our identity and our sense of self, but that isn't just a negative thing.
I will say one side of it that could be a bit more negative, or that is negative, because I'm quite a positivist in general about what we do online. Most people handle it pretty well, but for things like radicalization online, that can pick up on something that's there in someone, a need for belonging or a feeling that they're not viewed as equal in the world, and that community can suck people into it and, you know, get them to express parts of themselves that they weren't, you know, the violent side of themselves could kind of channel that emotion into something that's very negative. So there certainly are parts of the internet that can change people in a negative way, change their behavior in a negative way. So there definitely is that potential, but I think for most people, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Thank you. And a final quick question for both of you. We've been talking a lot about the importance and relevance of social norms in different online spaces and how they play a key part in informing how we act online and how we interact with others, but also how we present ourselves. Could you tell us a little bit about how these social norms are created or developed in those spaces?
Go on, Nicola, you first.
I haven't specifically done research on this, and I'm not sure if you have either, but from, you know, reading the literature, there's two key ways that norms can be created within a space. There's explicit ones. So sometimes you'll go to a forum and they'll ask you to first read the rules of how to behave in that forum. So that's a very explicit way of creating a community with particular ways that you're supposed to behave within it. And then you'll have things like moderators who will, you know, punish or silence somebody who doesn't behave according to those norms, or people who gently let you know that you're not behaving according to those norms. Sometimes there's more implicit ways where you go, let's say, communities online, like I was talking about fertility communities online, people who are maybe having trouble conceiving. And there might be explicit instructions about how to behave, but there's also implicit ways. They use a lot of acronyms. And one of the things about acronyms, aside from saving time, it creates an in-group language. And people who are there for a while understand what all the different acronyms use. So they'll use, you know, DD for darling daughter and so on. There's loads and loads and loads of them. So when you get there first, you don't necessarily know what everybody's talking about because there's so many acronyms. And so you've got to spend a bit of time in the community observing to figure out what people are talking about. And while you're observing the community, you're observing the norms of behavior, how they've set up that community, and what's appropriate as how to talk to each other so that you just don't land in and offend everybody. And so it's kind of, you know, it's not designed specifically for that purpose. It has arisen and it leads to a way of managing that community and the social norms within that community, which is quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. Nicola's described it perfectly, actually, and said everything, I think.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. It's been such an interesting event. So this actually also brings us to the end of the event today. We got a lot of brilliant questions in the Q&A. I didn't even get through half of them, I don't think. But first of all, I would just like to say thank you so much, Nicola and Catherine, for sharing your knowledge and insights from your research with us today. And to the rest of the audience, there's a final few things that I would like to mention to you before we say our goodbyes. So the recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 20th of June. So you will be contacted by email when this video is available to view. We also very much hope that you will continue to be engaged with York Festival of Ideas. So you can check out the website at yorkfestivalofideas.com for full details of all the events in the festival program. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this event and other events so we can continue to have this really fascinating conversation using the hashtag @YorkIdeas. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining this event today.